Is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday, January 18th issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And on the front page of the Times is a picture of Trump. First article was written by Maureen Dowd. Behold Donald of Deliria, Washington. There's a great scene in Lawrence of Arabia when Peter O'Toole Lawrence comes back from battle and meets with General Edmund Allenby, his British superior in Cairo. The bookish Lawrence tells Allenby he executed an Arab ally with his own pistol, and there was something about it I didn't like. Allenby reassures him that his distaste is to be expected. No, something else, Lawrence explains. I enjoyed it. Donald Trump was always an impresario of chaos. He told me that when violence broke out at his rallies, that it sizzled to the proceedings. He seemed proud of the anarchy and bloodshed in his name on January 6th. Yet he wasn't that keen on military adventurism, even though he liked military parades. He came to see W's imperialism in Iraq as a big, fat mistake. He thought our occupation of Muslim countries were a waste of time and money. He was more into deals than invasions, dreaming of beachfront hotels rising in North Korea and Gaza. But now, in his second term, he's morphed into Donald of Deliria. He's mad to make the military do his bidding. At a White House ceremony on Thursday honoring the Florida Panthers, the Stanley Cup champions, Trump mused about the players flanking him. Young, beautiful people. I hate them. You hate standing here with all this power behind you. But I got power too. It's called the United States military. I don't care. Trump Redux is infatuated with drone strikes and airstrikes. Tumsescent with the power of the world's greatest military, hungry to devour the hemisphere in one imperialistic gulp. He plucked the dictator of Venezuela out of his compound to plunder that country's oil. He demands that protesters in Iran not be killed, while stroking tension against protesters in Minnesota. He has infuriated Denmark, formerly one of the most pro-American countries in Europe, by warning he will strike a deal to get Greenland the easy way or get it the hard way. He threatened on Friday to slap tariffs on nations that resisted his efforts to grab Greenland. His belittling boast about swallowing Canada helped drive our nicest neighbor into the arms of China. Donald of Deliria is wallowing in brute force. He told Reuters that we shouldn't even have an election because his administration had accomplished so much. But in a new CNN poll, most respondents called Trump's second term a failure so far. Imperialism is ever so much easier than affordability. He has already ratcheted up a horrifying military style occupation of Minneapolis, pouring gasoline on a raging fire as always. He mulls over invoking the Insurance Act of 1807 to send troops there. As the daughter of a cop, I am sympathetic to the split-second life and death decisions the police have to make. But Jonathan Ross, the ICE officers who shot Renee Good, as she was trying to drive away, tragically overreacted, then called her a fucking bitch. He could have stepped aside and caught up with her later, since he had her license plate. As a Time story pointed out, Ross, formerly a National Guard member, deployed in Iraq embodies a post-9/11 militarization of border enforcement, a high-risk approach that favors counterinsurgency-style aggression over careful policing. Rahm Emanuel said on CNN scenes of masked ICE agents with no body cams roughing up people have become such a disturbing part of American landscape that the agency as we know it will have to end. ICE has become a lawless mob rather than law enforcement under President Trump, he said. When Times reporters asked the president in an interview whether there are any limits to his power, he replied, "My own morality, my own mind. God help us all." It's chilling when you combine Trump's stupefying greed with all the power in the world. It's almost quaint to look at the misrule of W. and Cheney. At least they made up some highfalutin cover story about bringing democracy to the Middle East, when the real story was closer to daddy issues for W and a Halliburton windfall for Cheney. Trump's entire doctrine is naked rapacity, from Venezuela to hijacking the Kennedy Center, to hideously remaking the White House in his own gaudy image. A fake peace prize from FIFA wasn't enough for him. The greedy little piggy was licking his lips as Maria Corina Machado, Venezuela's opposition leader, curried favor by handing over a Nobel Prize on Thursday. Pathetically, Trump accepted it, giving Machado a swag bag in return and included a medal with his picture on it. The Panthers presented Trump with 2 championship rings, a jersey, and said Trump 47 and a gold hockey stick. "Stick looks beautiful," said the gilt aficionado, fearing the jersey would be his only swag. "Maybe I get both. Who the hell knows? I'm president. I'll just take them." An editorial comment: regardless of your political bent, we certainly live in scary times. Next article is written by Jamil Bowie. This is not how a normal president speaks. Not long after his second inauguration and still riding high on his return to power, President Trump issued a stark proclamation on social media. "He who saves his country does not violate the law," he wrote on X and Truth Social platform, paraphrasing Sergei Bondarchuk's 1970 film Waterloo. Since Trump saw himself as saving the country, the message was simple. He was beyond the law, if not above it, outright. This wasn't a feint in the weeks and months to follow. His administration would break, skirt, ignore the law in pursuit of the president's agenda. As he nears the end of his first year of his second term, Trump has turned his attention abroad. Days after the start of the new year, he launched an attack on Venezuela that killed dozens of people and ended with the kidnapping, a word the president said was not a bad term for what happened, of Nicolas Maduro, the nation's authoritative ruler. Flush with the glow of successful operation, Trump then threatened military action against Cuba, demanding that the nation's regime negotiate before it's too late, and raised the possibility of strikes on Mexico. He has also begun to talk threateningly about Greenland. It appears to be a naked land grab, fueled by dreams of 19th century style territorial expansion. And why Greenland? Well, it's the nearest large landmass on Mercator projection maps, and Trump is nothing if not a simple man. Defending all this in a recent interview with one of my Times colleagues, Trump declared that he was not subject to international law, or really any law, in his conduct of foreign affairs. I don't need international law, he said. I'm not looking to hurt people. Asked if there were any limits on his power, Trump named his conscience. Yes, there's one thing, he said, my own morality. My own mind is the only thing that can stop me. In his 2024 campaign for White House, Trump told cheering audience that he would be a dictator, but only for one day. The interview, to say nothing of his actions over the past year, makes clear that Trump sees himself as something like a dictator, and he wants to be one for a bit longer than 24 hours. Trump, in his mind, an elected monarch, although not an enlightened one, whose whims are law and whose power extends to every inch of the United States and every corner in the Western Hemisphere. It should go without saying that he is not how a normal president speaks. Virtually all previous presidents have understood themselves as they are, agents of federal constitution. Even Andrew Jackson condemned King Andrew I by his Whig opponents for his unapologetic expansion of presidential authority, described himself as an instrument of the Constitution, and promised in his first inaugural address to keep steadily in view of the limitations as well as the extent of the executive power, trusting thereby to discharge the functions of any office without transcending its authority. Trump's assertion of unlimited authority, subject only to his moral judgment and his mind, whatever that means, is a total rejection of popular sovereignty and the logic of the Constitution. And for as much as the Trump administration speaks of defending Western civilization, the president's MAGA absolutism is also a challenge to the foundation of the Anglo-American political tradition. To the settlement of the Glorious Revolution and the defeat of the Stuart claims the divine right and parliamentary subordination. Another way to understand this is that Trump does not see himself as a constitutional officer. His power, as he sees it, flows from his person, not the office and certainly not the people whose only role, in his view, is to legitimize his desires. Trump is an anti-constitutional figure whose very pressure on American political scene is nothing less than a full-spectrum assault on Republican government and democracy. And it is a testament to the rot in our political system that in less than a year he has, with the help of Republicans in Congress, put the American Republic on life support, where it struggles with the creeping sickness of despotism. In fairness to Trump, however, he is not solely to blame for the present rate of affairs. His claim to unlimited presidential power rests significantly on the work of the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, in Trump versus U.S. Roberts and the Republican colleagues anointed one office of the presidency with immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts defined, somewhat vaguely, as anything extending from the president's core constitutional powers. Never mind that this language has no basis in the constitutional text or its drafting and ratification. Never mind that the framers, in fact, seem to accept the possibility that a president might be criminally prosecuted for actions in office after impeachment and removal. For Roberts, judicial accountability for wrongdoing was secondary to separation of powers and the energy of the executive. The president, in his view, has to be able to act. And the aim of Trump versus was to allow the president to perform the full breadth of his duties without ever needing to look behind his back. I think Roberts saw this as a modest effort to make government work better and preclude the prospect of tit-for-tat prosecution after each presidential election. But to Trump, Roberts' ruling was a license to unleash himself on the constitutional order. Perhaps this is why, after delivering his first speech to Congress last year, Trump thanked Roberts' gratitude for a Supreme Court that gave him license to act as a sovereign. The American public, then, is left not with a president, but with a man who imagines himself master and behaves like a tyrant, a man whose agents brutalize ordinary citizens and then defame them in the wake of their deaths, who has turned the nation's law enforcement apparatus against the political enemies, and who threatens the nation's allies with military force. A man who takes no interest in the work of government, but welcomes corruption, and who treats half the country as conquered territory, vassals to abuse it as they see it. Is the only thing Trump thinks can stop him are his own morality and his own mind. Our task, at least for those of us who view the state of things with outrage and anger, is to show him the folly of his words. The right is furious with liberal white women. The right is furious with liberal white women. If you read conservative media, you might have heard about a new danger stalking our besieged country. Last week, Fox News warned us about organized gangs of white moms using Antifa tactics against ICE. According to a column in the right-wing PJ Media, the greatest threat to our nation is a group of undicted domestic terrorists who are just AWFL, affluent, white, liberal women. The acronym is wrong, but never mind. The Canadian-influenced Lauren Chen, who had to leave the U.S. in 2024, the Department of Justice accused her of working for a Russian propaganda operation, but was allowed back in by the Trump administration, wrote that the ideology of women like Renee Good is almost totally responsible for the decline of Western civilization. It is as if the right is speedrunning the Martin Niemöller poem that begins, "First they came for the communists. ICE invasion of Minneapolis started with the demonization of Somalian immigrants. It took only weeks for conservative demagogues to direct their venom toward the middle-class women of the resistance. We're now seeing an outpouring of misogynist rage driven by both political expedience and psychosexual grievance." One reason Renee Good's death was such a shock is that we're not used to seeing law enforcement violence against middle-class white mothers. The citizenry has broadly recoiled. Her killing, in addition to being a human tragedy, has been a public relations disaster for the administration. According to an Economist YouGov poll, most Americans have seen videos of the shooting, and only 30% believe it was justified. A plurality of Americans say ICE is making cities less safe, and more people support than oppose abolishing the agency. In the face of such widespread public revulsion, the administration and its enablers have been trying to invent a terrorist threat to justify the increasing unpopular siege of Minneapolis. That's why the Justice Department pushed for a criminal investigation of Good's partner, Becca, leading 6 federal prosecutions to quit and protest. For authoritative leaders, lying itself isn't enough. They may act as if their lies are true, and the lies go far beyond Renee and Becca Good to smear the entire movement of which they were a part. Conservatives aren't wrong to see furious women as an obstacle to their dreams of mass deportation. During Donald Trump's first term, many outraged women protested to their members of Congress. They put their faith in prosecutors like Robert Mueller. Investigations and impeachment, they thought the system could strain a man that regarded as inimical American values. They now know they were wrong and that no one is coming to save them. So they may have turned to peaceful direct action, particularly against ICE, which they view, and with good reason, as a tip of the authoritative spear. I have more ICE whistles in my house than I can count because my neighbors are constantly handing them out, most recently at my daughter's dance recital. Similar bourgeois mobilization are happening all over the country. CNN reported that Renee Good served on the board of her son's charter school, which provided links to guides about opposing ICE. ICE watches are being organized in churches and neighborhood associations. In many ways, they are a manifestation of local civic health. They're also a problem for the right. These activists both document ICE brutality and often subjected to demonstrating the casual violence that Trump's paramilitary forces are bringing to American communities. Just last week, a woman named Patty O'Keefe described agents around a car as she wasn't sparing chemical irritants through the vents, breaking the windows and dragging her out. She was thrown in the back of an ICE vehicle, where she said to the driver, taunted her, "You guys got to stop obstructing us. That's why that lesbian bitch is dead." Oh. After 8 hours in detention, she said she was released without charges. To defend such treatment of activists, many of them women, right-wingers need to cast as enemies of the state. The editor of the Conservative National Review, Rich Lowry, wrote a column headline, "The Anti-ICE Insurgency," described Good almost as a suicidal militant. She went out of her way to confront ICE and created the predicate for the tragedy, which has been used to propagandize against ICE, mobilize more people to do what she did, he wrote. Insurgency feed off their martyrs. His language seems intended to rationalize ICE storming through Midwestern streets, kitted out as they headed into the battle in Fallujah. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Trump has now threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act. If he does so, some of the defense might point to scattered incidents of real violence by anti-ICE forces in Minneapolis. On Wednesday, Homestead Security claimed that an agent was assaulted with a snow shovel and a broom handle while trying to arrest a Venezuelan man. During the altercation, the agent shot the man in the leg. That led to an angry confrontation with about 200 protesters, some of whom threw fireworks towards ICE agents. But no normal administration would contemplate a military response to such small-scale disorder. Trump doesn't want to crush just criminal defiance, but the civil defense that he wishes he could criminalize. It wasn't long ago that casual contempt for white women was a domain of the left, at least part of the left that took books like White Fragility seriously. So it's striking how easily conservatives, who've been stewing over insults to white people for at least 5 years, has singled out a group of white women as the enemy. But it also makes sense, because everyone hates an apostate. In the right-wing imagination, these women are acting like harpies, an epithet often seen online. When they're opposed to the Helmies, Fox News, Will Cain described a weird kind of smugness. For MAGA, ICE eagerness to put women in their place might be a feature, not a bug. That article was written by Michelle Goldberg. Latin America is again a stage for U.S. imperial ambitions. President Trump has become increasingly entangled in Latin American politics. Less than a year into his second term, he has seized the president of Venezuela, imposed sanctions on Cuba and Nicaragua, threatened Mexico with airstrikes, and Colombia with a coup. He has imposed crushing tariffs on the Brazilian exports, sent deportees to El Salvador's infamous supermarket prison, pressured Panama to limit China's influence, and meddled in the internal politics of Honduras and Guatemala. Mr. Trump's turn toward Latin America isn't surprising, for often during the time of global turbulence, like the moment we now found ourselves in, presidents seek to safe harbor there. Latin America is where U.S. leaders have projected power beyond their borders, not only with brute force, including all those coups Washington orchestrated, but with moral suasion as well. For presidents of both parties, Latin America served as a wellspring, a perpetual reinvention, and the source of much of their ideological creativity. This is especially true for what make political scientist Stephen Skowronek calls reconstructive presidents, leaders who work to build new political orders and restore political legitimacy after periods of acute crises. It's tempting to see Mr. Trump as continuing the tradition. He too came by power during a period of overlapping domestic and global crisis, and he is trying to use Latin America as a stage to project strength and shore up its political movement. But unlike his predecessors who believed that power needed to be legitimized and anchored universal norms, Mr. Trump acts as though power is its own justification, tempered solely by the way he says his own morality. It's as if he or one of his advisors had read Theodices's Melian dialogue. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because I've never heard of this article or book. It's Thucydides. So we'll say Thucydides. So obviously it must be Greek. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must, but skimp what comes next. The strong are undone by their hubris. The most notable example by far of successful reconstructive president is Franklin Roosevelt. Came to power in the depths of the Great Depression and had to not only rebuild the nation, but also somehow find a new moral framework to replace the cult of rugged individualism and Anglo-Saxon supremacy. That, despite society's near-total collapse, still held sway. Latin Americans helped him do so. Roosevelt, inaugurated in 1933, had global aspirations, but with fascism and militarism on the rise in Europe and Asian nations to be the south of the U.S., offered the only place where he could test out his foreign policy ideas. For decades, Latin America statesmen have been demanding that Washington stop intervening in their affairs and recognize the absolute sovereignty of all nations, no matter their size or strength. Roosevelt did so in spectacular fashion, with the New York Times declaring that our era of imperialism nears its end. For the first time, Washington honestly seemed to be trying to tame America's clamorous capitalist. When first Bolivia and then Mexico nationalized the holdings of Standard Oil, Roosevelt let them. The phrase good neighbor is well known and shop-worn, used by about every administration since Roosevelt to describe friendly Western Hemisphere relations. But in the 30s, the term meant much more, especially domestically. Roosevelt supporters organized hundreds of chapters of the Good Neighbor League, which formed the backbone of the New Deal's growing coalition of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews of all race. Ruth Tuck, an anthropologist, was a Good Neighbor leaguer who exposed Klan attacks on indigenous and Latino people in the borderlands. Speaking at League rallies, she linked the New Deal's appeal to better treatment of migrant workers and more human relations with the southern half of the hemisphere. The Good Neighbor League brought black voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. The organization drew on popular politicians and liberal intellectuals, including Eleanor Roosevelt and Langston Hughes, who recognized the importance of good neighbor programs that welcome people from all Latin American cultures, whatever the racial strains or complexions may be. Reactionaries, including the right-wing radio priest Charles Coughlin, recognized it too, and didn't like how Good Neighbors encapsulated a tolerant, anti-racist, pro-union, left liberal humanism. Roosevelt appreciated the phrase good neighbor so much that he wanted to copyright it. He framed the League's work as a spiritual awakening, heralding a new way for citizens to think about their place in the world and the obligations of government to help them live a dignified life. This broad hemisphere vision of social citizenship allowed Roosevelt to breathe new life into a moribund liberalism, and it gave him the moral authority he would need to rally the world's free nations against fascism. Ronald Reagan, another Reconstructive president, took office in '81 with the New Deal consensus in tatters, pulled apart by defeat in Vietnam and the rising oil prices. Watergate and the economically dismal 1970s had spread cynicism among the citizens, a distrust of U.S. military power, and a loss of faith in the virtues of an activist government of the kind Roosevelt preached. Reagan campaigned promising to restore faith in the New Deal, but in the redemptive power of markets and militarism, and in the promise of Americas. Like Roosevelt, Reagan didn't have many places where he could rehearse his ideas and tactics. The U.S. had been driven out of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and was too volatile, and superpower nuclear rivalry meant America had to tread tenderly in much of the rest of the world. This was the only Latin America, especially Central America, where left-wing revolutionists had overthrown a U.S. ally in Nicaragua and were advancing in Guatemala and El Salvador. It was there in all of Latin America broadly where Reagan let the movement conservatives who carried him to power have free rein, not just to defeat the left, but also re-sanctify U.S. power. The Reagan administration, allied with brutal men in Latin America, yet conservatives of various stripes, rescued muscular anti-communism from the muck of Vietnam and gave it wings. Traditional conservatives used the wars in Central America to argue that the United States to regain its confidence. Neoconservatives insisted that the U.S. had to say not just what it is fighting against communism, but also what it was fighting for, democracy and human rights. And as Washington pushed to deregulate economies, conservative Christians argued that the free market was not as radical priests in Latin America would have it, void of morality. It was the venue where God's grace was made manifest and goodness rewarded. Invigorated by engagement with Latin America, Reaganism supplanted the New Deal or with a new legitimating ideology founded on a neoliberal conception of individual rights, electoral democracy, and freedom. Until recently, it claimed power support of home and abroad. Here we go again. A nation turning away from the rest of the world toward Latin America. Mr. Trump, too, has a story to tell about Latin America, and it isn't pretty. He likes to play the role of the business cutthroat, corporate pirate, devoid of any ideology, save greed. We're going to bring out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground, he said, shortly after U.S. troops captured Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela and his wife, Celia Flores. Such unadorned venality and disdain for diplomatic polites cramped Trumpism, preventing it from forming the basis of a Majorian coalition. Roosevelt and Reagan differed sharply in politics, yet both grasped how depicting Latin America as aligned with the U.S. could convert partisan alliance into durable governing majorities. Turning foreign policy into a matter of national identity, they renovated Americanism as humane and universal. Mr. Trump, in contrast, seems unconcerned with transforming dominance into hegemony or with broadening his base. He seeks only raw power in which the U.S. dominates the hemisphere because it can dominate, where it killed speedboat captains because it can kill speedboat captains. He's using the region to send a message to the nation of the world. Don't cross us, as J.D. Vance recently said, referring to the Venezuela strike. The reduction of Latin America to a sphere of coercion, extraction, and threat reflects in an ugly way in domestic politics. The same rule by domination Mr. Trump showcased abroad is little different from what is being applied at home. Polarization is deepening. Cities are under assault by federal forces, and the degrading, at times lethal treatment of citizens and non-citizens alike by government agency is now routine. Whereas Roosevelt held up the Western Hemisphere as a model of international cooperation for the world to emulate, the Trump administration's Latin America as target practice. Whereas Reagan's sunny capitalist pan-Americanism silenced anti-migrant extremists in his coalition, Mr. Trump tribalism strokes them, with a growing number of young self-identified conservatives openly embracing white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and Nazism. Mr. Trump's hemisphere turn leads not out of the crisis, but deeper into it. The next article is called "Look at the Country That We Have Become," written by a columnist by the M. Eason. A year into Donald Trump's second term, friends who live outside the United States continue to express shock at the news that comes from this country, often mixed with concern for my safety. I shrug. Even those of us in the United States who oppose this administration actions have a way of normalizing them. On Tuesday, I saw a news release in my inbox, a new filing in the legal case against the construction of the giant immigrant detention facility at Florida. I, like many other Americans it seems, had almost forgotten about Alligator Alcatraz. In Europe, attention has been unwavering. Journalists are writing articles and making documentaries about America's building a concentration camp. On these shores, we have simply become a country that builds concentration camps. It's only one of the changes we have absorbed in the last year. We have become a country where people are disappeared by a paramilitary force that hunts them down in the apartments, on city streets, and country roads. And even in the courts, less than a year ago, videos of ICE agents would go viral on social media posts about ICE sightings would send chills down our spines. Now, even the most high-profile detentions have faded from view. Who has been released? Who has been deported? Who is still missing? Who can keep track? We have become a country where a person can be summarily executed in public for protesting that paramilitary force. After an ICE agent killed Renee Good by shooting her 3 times at point-blank range in Minneapolis on January 7th, President Trump, Vice President Vance, and other federal officials said the shooting was justified as an act of self-defense, the videos show otherwise, and pointed to Good's ostensible affiliation with left-wing groups, apparently affirming that protest is now punishable by death in America. We have become a country whose federal government deploys military and paramilitary in the streets of major cities, terrorizing the residents in the guise of protecting them. A foreign observer taking stock of the United States could describe us as a nation on the brink of civil war, but we can barely keep up with the list of cities where troops have been or still in the streets. Washington, Los Angeles, Chicago, Portland, Memphis, New Orleans. Number of armed federal agents deployed to Minneapolis may now be 5 times the size of the city's police force. We have become a country where government is attacking its universities, defunding research, reversing scientific advances, assaulting museums, and howling our cultural institutions. Few of these attacks, carried out in broad daylight, announced in executive orders, extol its speeches, and put on display in giant metal letters. Meet meaningful resistance. We're making ourselves stupider. We have become a country that demonstratively trampled on international laws. Our military bombs a different nation every week, commits murder on the high seas, and removes foreign political leaders by force. Our government threatens the world, including our allies, with its imperial ambitions. We are a country ruled by a megalomaniac, whose views are openly hateful and proudly ignorant, whose avarice knows no bounds, and whose claim to power is absolute. Foreign leaders try to appease him with flattery and curry his favor with gifts. It rarely works to temper his appetite or even catch his attention, but it's seemingly all they can do. To be sure, some elements of our current conditions predate Trump. The country has been maintaining the world's largest carceral system, one of the least humane in the Western world. It formed the foundations for Alligator, Alcatraz, and other concentration camps for immigrants. Police executions of black people have long been a pattern. The origins of ICE and its parent agency, Department of Homeland Security, conceived as a secret police force, go back to 9/11. The culture war debate, at least in the 80s, and disregarding international law, playing the world's heavily armed policeman, has been a long-standing bipartisan tradition, as have increasingly hostile, restrictive immigrant policies. The presidency in itself has been growing less transparent and more powerful for at least a couple of decades. I am not arguing that what we have become this year is just more of the same. Few people would have made that argument anymore, but the truth is, even though we are taught to think of history as a series of definitive turning points with specific dates, wars, revolutions, assassinations, declarations of independence, decrees announcing martial laws, no transformation is instant or total. The Trump administration has moved at breakneck speed, and still, it hasn't broken everything yet. We're still a country with a robust civil society. The lawyers have fought the administration in court. The people have rallied against Trump's usurpation of power and have organized to protect their neighborhoods from ICE. But Trump attacks on universities, his assault on the judiciary, and his threats against nonprofits and philanthropies have already altered the way civil society functions. The universities and the foundations aren't what they were a year ago, and neither of the judiciary where so much civil society work is concentrated. And the execution of Renee Good has surely affected every potential protester's mental calculus. We still have independent media, but taking stock of how much the media landscape has changed is sobering. Even before the 2024 election, the owners of the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times curtailed the independence of the editorial page. Soon after the election, ABC News and then the parent company of CBS paid millions of dollars to settle what certainly appeared to be frivolous lawsuits filed by Trump. He has filed several more, including against the New York Times, and another against 20 individual members of the Pulitzer Prize Board, which includes Time journalists. Now, under new ownership, CBS is rapidly transforming itself into a Trump-friendly network. Autocats destroy the free press in at least two ways: by cracking down, as Trump has done, through lawsuits and regulatory pressures, and by reappointing access of information. In October, the Trump administration effectively kicked legacy media out of the Pentagon, replacing them with loyal journalists and influence. The media, like civil society, is a much diminished company with what it was a year ago. We still have elections, but how free and fair will the 2026 elections be? Trump doesn't carry a grudge just against the elections authorities of many states. He made that grudge a centerpiece of his 2024 campaign. Since he returned to office, his administration has taken a series of executive actions and filed a series of lawsuits aimed at restricting access to the polls, purging voter rolls, limiting the independence of local groundwork for the systematic intimidation of both voters and election officials. States have joined the effort. Florida's cracking down on voter registration drives. Ohio and other states have introduced restrictive voter laws. Georgia has limited poll hours and banned providing food or water to people standing in line to vote. Texas has gerrymandered a map that threatened to disenfranchise black and Latino voters, and many wipe out Democratic congressional seats out of existence. And the Supreme Court has allowed this controversial new map to be used in the 2026 midterms. Add to this Trump's threat to deploy the military to deal with the enemy from within during the election, and his promise to send America's abundant to a bribe, 2,000 checks toward the end of the year, and you have the prospect of elections that are far less free and a lot less fair than the last one. As for the next presidential election, Trump has made his intentions clear. He is not planning to leave his throne. He may look for a pretext to cancel the vote. When President Zelensky told him Ukraine can't have an election during the war, Trump visited it up. So you mean if we happen to be in a war with somebody, no more elections? Oh, that's good. He may find a way to invalidate the vote after the election. He has been laying the groundwork for such a move since his first term. Even if he doesn't, it's foolish to think that this iteration of our national nightmare will end in 3 years. One term for a regime that maximizes the trappings of democracy, such as legislators, courts, and elections, but use them primarily as decoration, is electoral authoritarianism. This is what we are becoming. It matters what we call things, what we call ourselves. It matters for wonky reasons like reading the polls. Public opinion functions differently in democratic and non-democratic societies. But it matters more for how we think about the future. We can't count on change being brought out by elections when we can't count on elections. We can't count on the freedom and resources we enjoy today still be able to us in tomorrow. Ask anyone who lives in a country that become an autocracy. They will tell you some version of a story about the walls closing in, about space getting smaller and smaller. The space they are talking about is freedom. In Russia, mass protests used to be possible. The first time people got prison terms for peaceful protest in 2012, I wrote a whole book about it. Then mass protest became impossible, and the only option was what we called the one-person picket. Person standing alone with a sign. Then people started getting arrested for standing alone with a blank piece of paper, and then for liking something on social media. Russian journalists used to know what they could write freely as long as they stuck to culture and avoided politics. Now, a person can get arrested for performing a tune by a band songwriter. Of course, the United States is not Russia or Hungary or Venezuela or Israel or any of the many other democracies that have turned or are turning themselves into autocracies. But now is the time to focus on the similarities and try to learn from the way other countries have cracked down on protest, eviscerated their electoral systems, limited their media system, and built concentration camps. The only way to keep the space from imploding is to pop up the walls, to claim all the room that still is speaking, writing, public, protesting, voting. It's what the people of Minnesota appear to be doing, and it's something each of us needs to do right now while we still can. Opinion, a Democrat who connects with working class. In July, Representative Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington proposed an amendment to a bill calling for an inquiry, what she described as a plague in this country of headline brightness. She introduced the provision in a short speech to which she lapsed into obscenity and suggested that blinding lights on American roads were part of the inexorable deterioration in basic quality of life so many people feel today. Implicitly gibed her fellow members for their failure to respond to that feeling that seemed to acknowledge that many of her listeners had heard talk like this before. When a solitary colleague didn't know to clap, she turned and joked, "I'll give you your $20 later." A Democrat, she was gesturing to the crucial point of her political project, which is renamed obscure to many political observers, even as her profile has risen sharply in the past year. She implored people in the room to show that they were living in the same reality as regular people, and suggested that paying attention to the sense of helplessness or the anger caused by small issues like the proliferation of absurdly bright headlights offered a path to a more profound and potential radical new style of democratic politics. He who is faithful in a small thing, she quoted from the gospel, is faithful in a great thing also. This is an advertisement. It says, what matters most, the march to autocracy. The United States has never fully lived up to our nation's founding ideals, but our democracy set us apart from rule by monarchs, despots, and dictators. As we approach America's 250th anniversary, I'm mindful of Abraham Lincoln's fervent hope that our government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Today, our rights and freedoms are under attack by an administration that is violating our laws and seeking limitless power. We, the people, must act. Freedom of speech and the press are enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution, but the Trump administration has ramped up attacks against both. Last week, in a rare and likely illegal move, the FBI raided the home of a Washington Post reporter, seizing our phone computers. The reporter covers the Trump administration reshaping of federal government to enforce his agenda. Federal officials are investigating 2 U.S. senators for the participation in a video reminding U.S. military and intelligence service that they are obligated to refuse illegal orders from the president. Trump expressed support for imprisoning and educating the Democratic lawmakers who participated in the video, since they should have been unthinkable coming from any other American president. The propensity for retaliation and suppression of rights is reshaping public discourse in America. Hundreds of Americans gave their push in the wake of Charles Kirk assassination, including someone who simply posted Kirk's own words. Our Texas affiliated with the AFT sued the Texas Education Agency for threatening and even terminating teachers' protested private speech. The Education expressed outside the classroom. Two things are true. Kirk's assassination was abhorrent, and America doesn't lose their First Amendment rights when they become teachers. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, January 18th issue of the New York Times Opinion Section. We read from the New York Times Opinion Section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,